As you know, today our topic is the problem of anger. And one thing I've noticed over many years of teaching A Course in Miracles is that we spiritual students don't like to think of ourselves as having an anger problem. We are the calm ones, the introspective ones, the ones who don't get all red-faced and shouty. We know better than that. And yet, while we don't want to see ourselves as angry, at the same time, there's a part of us that actually believes anger is good, that it's healthy. Anger is a sign that you have boundaries. Anger is a sign that you care about justice. And beyond just the spiritual space, we live in a culture at large that celebrates righteous anger, a culture that says that if you are not angry at what's going on right now, you are not paying attention. So here we have this very curious situation. We don't want anger in ourselves, and yet we believe that anger is valuable in the world. And doesn't that strike you as a little odd? If anger is so good, why don't we want it for ourselves? And if we don't want it, then why do we keep defending it? Part of the answer lies in the fact that our culture says that anger is fine as long as you keep it in check. This is where we get the phrase anger management, and it's not called anger elimination for a reason. We want to be angry enough to be awake, but not so angry as to be out of control. And maybe that sounds right to you until you realize that what this actually means is a lifetime of monitoring ourselves, always gauging whether we're in the right kind or the right amount of anger. The beauty of A Course in Miracles is, as always, that it wants us to step out of this mentality altogether. The Course does not teach us how to manage our anger better or how to channel it more constructively. What the Course wants us to do is to take a stand against our anger and remove it from our mind altogether. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. What does that even mean? And how could we possibly do such a thing? Before we get into all of that, though, I said earlier that most of us don't see ourselves as angry people. So I just want to begin here by asking a few questions, and I'd like you to notice what comes up for you when I do. You don't have to write anything down. All you have to do is pay attention to how you respond to these questions. They're all yes or no. So, yes or no. Is there someone in your life, or maybe a lot of people, who you just don't like very much? When you see people in public, do you actively try and avoid them? You run into your neighbor at the grocery store, do you hightail it the other way? Do habits of other people regularly get under your skin, like how they chew or how they say things? Is there someone in your life who you think that you've forgiven when really you're just pretending they don't exist? Is there someone in your life who you really want to feel guilt or remorse for something that they did to you? Do you feel that you give to others more than they give to you? So often, when we think of anger, we think of it as being outraged or being in these constant battles in our life. But if you answered yes to many of the questions that I've just asked, the Course calls that anger too. And in fact, the Course says, quote, a slight twinge of annoyance is nothing but a veil drawn over intense fury. So I think it's time that we faced head on that we all have an anger problem. We are all far angrier in our lives than we want to admit to ourselves or that we want people to see. And all you have to do is take a peek at your own life and a glimpse at our world to see that that is true. So the first step, as they say in AA, is to admit that there's a problem, right? The Course knows that too. The Course knows that we can't get free from something that we won't acknowledge is there. And that is why it has an absolute ton of teachings on anger. The Course mentions the word attack 746 times. And that is a huge number. Surely part of the reason for that is because we don't want to admit that we attack. An attack, of course, is an expression of anger. So think about, again, how you just answered those questions. The Course calls all of that a form of attack. But we don't want to think of ourselves as people who attack. And so we have become very good at hiding it. And the way we hide our anger could be the topic of a whole other sermon, but just a couple of things that we do to hide our attack and our anger. The first is that we tell ourselves that our anger is really something else, something other than anger. So we'll say, no, I'm not angry, I'm hurt. Or no, I'm not angry, I'm afraid. And we do get hurt and we do get scared. I am not trying to minimize that. But at the same time, we should be clear-eyed about the fact that it's much easier to say, I'm hurt or I'm afraid than it is to say, you know what, I am goddamn furious right now. The more palatable emotion is fear. And so we make fear the problem. But while we make fear the problem, the rage stays hidden and intact in our mind. Another way that we hide our anger is that we say that anger is this primal emotion. We didn't choose it. It's hardwired into us, and we need that anger in us to change the world. But notice what this view does as well. It's the same as calling our anger fear and hurt. Saying that anger is our evolutionary response that's needed to motivate change takes our anger completely out of our hands. Now, anger isn't something that we're doing. Anger is the natural result of something that's being done to us. And because of that, because anger isn't something we're doing, it's something that's being done to us, we can't help it. Of course, we have to be mad about this horrible thing that happened in this world. How else is it going to change? But if you look closely, what you see is this message that if we're the victim, then the anger isn't really ours. If we're the victim, then we're not responsible for the anger. And again, that is yet another way that the anger stays hidden and intact in our mind. And again, I mentioned this earlier, we really do like to hide our anger just by denying that it's there and adopting the persona of good spiritual people. We don't judge. We have soft words, soft belly, just love. But the Course doesn't let us get away with that. In the Song of Prayer supplement, the Course is being sarcastic when it says, "Behold, how good are you, who bear with patience and with saintliness the anger and the hurt another gives, and do not show the bitter pain you feel." So in other words, we can't hide by being the good one. From a Course perspective, that's just another way that we have become highly skilled at keeping our anger underground. No matter how we try to hide it, all of this only demonstrates how incredibly uncomfortable we are with our own attacks. Workbook lesson 333 in the Course says that we take the conflict in us and we evade it, we set it aside, we deny it, we disguise it, we see it somewhere else, we call it by another name, and we even flat out deceive ourselves. Meanwhile, the one thing we won't do is the one thing the Course says we have to do if we're ever going to get free of our anger, and that is face it as something purely negative that we freely choose to have. So, going back to my original question at the beginning of this message, would we even need all of these ways of avoiding or hiding or denying our anger if we were truly okay with it? We must not be okay with it. And that is the very thing the Course is trying to get us to look at. So I'm going to get into what the Course would have us do with our anger in just a minute. But first, I want to talk to you about why the Course considers all forms of anger to be forms of insanity. If we're ever going to get to a place where we're willing to give our anger up, we have to understand why we're doing it, right? Why are we holding on to all of this anger? We've got a lot of good reasons for being angry, or so we think. What does the Course have to say that could possibly outweigh the reasons that we hold on to our anger? Again, so much that can be said on this topic, but it really boils down to two things. Number one, the Course says that anger is insanity because it harms everyone, including you. So we've convinced ourselves that anger will help other people because if only they understand how wrong they are, then they would improve and be better people. But the Course doesn't let us get away with that either. And to be fair, other people don't let us get away with that. How often have you criticized someone only to have them turn around and say, hey, thanks, I'll fix that right away? Sometimes it happens, but we all know it's not the norm. What is the norm is where the Course says straight out that our anger is designed to make other people feel guilty so that they'll do what we want. Anger is a motivator. It makes people move, and that's why we like it. In chapter 15 of the text, the Course says, quote, all anger is nothing more than an attempt to make someone feel guilty. And the logic here is very simple. If I pour my wrath on you, if I pour my tears on you, you'll do what I want. We have all done this more times than we care to admit. It's another way of saying, look at the pain you are causing me. You need to feel guilty for all of my suffering. And when you feel guilty for what you have done to me, then you'll give me what I want. So it doesn't matter the wrapping that anger comes in, whether it's rage or whether it's tears or whether it's avoidance, that twinge of annoyance. From a Course perspective, it is all insanity. And it's not only hurtful to others, which we know, it's hurtful to us as well. Again, the devil's bargain that we've made with anger is that we think it makes us safe. We think that if we just get mad enough, then people will listen, they'll move, they'll give us what we want. And if they give us what we want, then we'll be safe. But the Course literally calls this an insane belief. The Course says that the more anger you invest outside of yourself, the safer you think that you become. But it's a lie. The more anger you invest outside of yourself, the weaker you become. And that's because anger is the sword we hold above our own head. We think it's pointing at other people, but really it's just hurting us. It's hurting them too, but it's hurting us as well. Some of you will remember that during the forgiveness challenge that we hosted a few years ago, Robert used a similar image when he likened unforgiveness to a gun that we think we're firing at other people, only the gun only backfires and shoots us. What is unforgiveness, which that example applied to? What is unforgiveness if not a form of anger? And so you can see how all of this is connected, right? If the Course is leading us to a place where we are giving up our grievances, then it's the same thing as saying we're giving up our anger. And I want to draw another line for you here because we talk a lot about forgiveness being the central teaching of the Course. And when we talk about forgiveness, we talk about how forgiveness in the Course is based on a different view of reality. It's not based on what we think is real. We're basing our forgiveness on what God thinks is real, what God says is real. And it's the same exact idea here with our anger. Anger is out of keeping with God's reality. It is not helpful. It is not necessary. It is just the result of a false interpretation. Anger is how it feels to have a certain interpretation of reality that is ultimately not true. So anger is the result of an interpretation of reality that is not true. And I know that that sounds difficult to believe. I know that that sounds outlandish. Just look at our world, look at what happens here, look at the wars, the harm, the abuse, the poverty, and so on. But the Course has a view of reality, which at the end of the day, what it means is that the only things that are truly real are the things that are eternal. So, what does that mean? That means God is real, heaven is real, your holiness and invulnerable nature are real. The other person's holiness and invulnerable nature are real. And that's really it. And so, for this reason, anger is always the result of a false interpretation and not real facts. In section 17 of the Manual for Teachers, the Course says that it is always, quote, an interpretation, it's always an interpretation that gives rise to negative emotions, regardless of their seeming justification by what appears as facts. So, in other words, if anger is never based on the real facts, the eternal facts, if anger is based on a false interpretation made by you, or more specifically, your ego, then anger is never justified. And the Course says this over and over and over again. 19 times the Course mentions some form of the word justify in connection with anger, always making the point in some way that anger is never justified. The Course says that anger recognizes a reality that is not there. When we see people who have lost touch with reality, we call them insane. And that's what the Course says we are when we're angry. In the workbook, the Course says it point blank. Anger is insane. As Robert and I like to say, madness is madness. So, can we take on board the idea that anger is insane? Can we let in the idea that madness is madness? Can we admit that anger is not our big evolutionary gift? Anger is a spiritual disease. And it's not a disease that happens to us. It's a disease we are choosing whenever we choose an interpretation of what doesn't fit with what is ultimately real. So, as usual with the Course, these ideas are radically different than what we see around us. I was saying to Robert yesterday, can you imagine watching a movie where no one gets angry? It's practically impossible. We feel like we need anger to move the plot forward. Such it is with ourselves. But if you read the Course enough, one of the things you'll notice is that the Course isn't forcing you into anything. The Course is always trying to reason you into a new perception of things. And you really see that here with anger. The Course is saying, yes, you can make people feel guilty with your anger. Yes, you can scare people into doing what you want them to do for a while, but it's always going to be at the cost of resentment in them and guilt in you. And in the end, that has a cost. And in the end, it really doesn't work. I learned this firsthand over the years with my youngest son. Like a lot of teenagers, he can be a little unmotivated. I have tried anger, but it doesn't work. He just shuts down and freezes me out. I have tried being purely loving, calling out the fact that, hey, maybe you should do your homework, but not actually making any demands. And that didn't work either. He failed his classes. And so, what I've done instead is I have retained the love and dropped the anger. And the way I've done that is with adding dispassionate consequences. So matter of fact consequences. So one example of that is while I'm in England, my son is living in my townhouse in Charlotte. And when he didn't pass his classes one semester, I said, look, I love you and you are more than welcome to live here. I want you to live here. But if you don't pass next semester, you're going to have to live with your dad. And his dad stacked on another set of consequences that said, if you don't pass this semester, you're going to have to pay yourself for the next one. There was no yelling, there was no tears, but there was accountability. And there was, in the end, a change of behavior. He started doing the work and he passed his classes. And that's the outcome that we're all looking for. We want our anger to motivate different behavior. But I didn't have to hurt my kid by shouting at him, and I didn't have to punch a hole in the wall in the process. The thing is, though, if he didn't pass, it would have been very hard. It would have been very sad, but I would have held on those consequences. He would have had to face those consequences. And even through that, I still wouldn't have poured anger on him. I just would have said in a very matter of fact way, look, you can't live here and you have to pay for your next semester. And oh, by the way, the next thing is your car. So my point here is that we don't have to keep doing this dance with anger where we suppress it over here and express it over here, where yelling a little bit is okay as long as you're not violent. No, the Course says it is all destructive. It is all insane. And in the end, it doesn't work anyway. And so what I'd like to do now is to take everything that I've shared with you so far and put it into a process. So now that you know, what do you do? I have a 5-step process for getting rid of our anger, starting with the first thing that we can do to get rid of it is to notice our anger despite all the ways in which it tries to hide. We can't get rid of our anger again if we don't admit that we have it. So we have to face that it's there, and we have to face the fact that anger doesn't always look like rage. It looks like that person we avoid at the supermarket. It looks like getting annoyed at that person with the habit who drives us crazy. It looks like the measuring sticks that we hold for other people that they never seem to meet, and then they meet our annoyance in response. The Course calls all of that anger. And in lesson 21, it says, quote, try not to let the little thoughts of anger escape you. Try not to let the little thoughts of anger escape you. And it's got little in quotation marks. Lesson 21 is all about dispelling our anger. And it's a reminder that this is why we do our practice periods throughout the day. We do our practice periods because we're trying to dissolve those little thoughts of anger before they accumulate and turn into big grievances. So that's number one. Notice your anger despite all the ways in which it tries to hide. The second thing that we do to get rid of, or we need to do rather, to get rid of our anger is we can remember that it's not what we want. Our anger is hurting the other person, but it's also holding that sword above our own head. And every time we give into the anger, every time we relive that pain or replay that argument or stoke that outrage, we have to remember that we're the ones getting hurt. We're hurting other people, that's for sure, but we're hurting ourselves in the process every single time. And third, we can remember that our anger comes from an interpretation that isn't true. The Course says the moment you feel even that faintest hint of irritation, you should, quote, instantly realize that you have made an interpretation that is not true. Your facts may be right on the ground. Something genuinely unfair probably did happen. The Course isn't saying that there's no accountability for that. But the Course is saying that even if something happened to you that was genuinely unfair, if you're angry, it's because you have the big picture wrong. So, in other words, you're not seeing what is ultimately real in the situation. And because your interpretation is missing that, what is ultimately real, it isn't true. So, again, what's ultimately real? God is real. Your holiness is real. The other person's holiness is real. Anger can't see any of that. So anger's out of touch with true reality. And what is out of touch with true reality is insanity. So this means anger, any anger that is built on top of your interpretation, your ego's interpretation, isn't justified. And so you don't have to keep it. So that all leads us to choosing a new interpretation. Recognizing that anger comes from an interpretation that isn't ultimately true, we lay down our sword. And at this point, you don't have to be fully convinced that only truth is true. All you have to do at this point is be willing to consider the fact that there might be another way of seeing things than what that angry lens is telling you. And that part is huge because the manual says that once this is even dimly grasped, the way is open. Now it is possible to take the next step. So all you have to do at this point is to think, to coin a phrase, there must be a better way. And I know for a fact that that's true. I know I'm talking a lot about my kids in this message, and I hope they never see this. But many of you know that on January 11th of 2011, I had a real shameful moment of anger towards my kids who were 6 and 5 at the time. It's actually what got me started on the spiritual path that led me to the Course. I was so horrible to them one morning that on the way to school, my oldest son looked at me and he said, "Mommy, you make me sad." And that was it for me. That was the day I laid down my sword and I said, I am done with anger with these guys. And unfortunately, I haven't been as good at giving up anger in other areas of my life, but I really did give it up with my kids. And my relationship with them is entirely different because of it. I really do feel like that is an area of my life where I got this right. And I am so grateful for it. So, the last step to releasing our anger after we lay down our sword is to ask the Holy Spirit what to do next and act on his guidance. So I'm paraphrasing here, but I mentioned earlier that line from the manual for teachers that says, if you sense even the faintest hint of irritation as you respond to anyone, instantly realize that you have made an interpretation that is not true. And the very next sentence of that passage, after you've recognized that you've made an interpretation that is not true, the very next sentence says, then turn within to the eternal guide and let him judge what the response should be. So this is where, after noticing our anger, after we remember it's not what we want, after we remember that it comes from an interpretation that isn't true, now we can actually be useful. Now we can actually do something healing. Now we can step back and let him lead the way. So we ask the Holy Spirit, for example, what would you have, where would you have me go? What would you have me do? What would you have me say, and to whom? And when we take action from that place, when the anger is cleared from our mind and there's room for guidance to come in, then we can be the miracle workers that we're called to be. The section of the manual that says we can turn within to our eternal guide and let him judge what our response should be is a section called How is Correction Made? I don't think we talk about this enough here at the circle. If you want to do yourself a favor today, I would suggest that you go into the course and read that section of the manual for teachers. It's called How is Correction Made? And if you don't have a copy of the course, you can read it online for free at acimce.app. Because here in that section, we have the course's answer to how we correct, which is what we're trying to do with our anger. We think correction is made with our anger. We think that we have to be angry or nothing gets corrected in this world. We think that if we can just make people feel guilty enough, maybe they'll do what we want. But again, just look around and see how far we've gotten with those tools. That section says, and take this in, that section says, whatever the thoughts of this world, we can respond, quote, wholly without anger. Imagine that. Whatever the thoughts of this world, and the thoughts of this world can get pretty gnarly, we can respond wholly without anger. I know we're not there yet, but I hope today has at least introduced you to the possibility that you could do this if you wanted to, if you wanted it enough. So I'm going to leave you with something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is that a few months ago, I attended a Wise Women retreat with Marianne Williamson. And on the opening night during the audience Q&A, the vibe in the room was pretty much, isn't it terrible what's happening in our world? The participants who spoke were all grabbing the mic and reciting one horrible story after another. This child was abused. This woman was sexually assaulted. And after about 3 or 4 stories like that, Marianne took the mic back and she said, look, we all live in this world. We all know what happens here. The purpose of our time together this weekend is not to figure out how much we can hate the rapist. The purpose of our time together this weekend is to figure out what is ours to do to build a better world so that there are no more rapists. And that's it. That's essentially the whole sermon right there. The purpose of our lives is not to fuel the anger of this world. The purpose of our lives is to heal it, to stand for the alternative. And we won't get there as long as we think that we need our anger to keep ourselves safe in this world. We will only get there when we understand that God's safety, God's reality, is so much bigger than anything that we think that we need to defend ourselves against here. Anything that we think we need to be angry about here, we set that aside and do our part to build that better world.